Alright, so you may have recalled the Dualism and Materialism video lecture, uh, where we assessed materialist theories of the mind, which basically claim that the mind and the brain are identical, and then we looked at some, well, really powerful dualist arguments against it. And I kind of left that lecture with the conclusion that materialism, insofar as it has the commitment that the mind is numerically identical to the brain, fails. Well, we're going to give it one more chance. Maybe we weren't completely fair, so we're going to take another stab at it, and we're going to look at today what is known as the identity theory of the mind, which is covered in the cover pages 235 to 241. All right. What is it like for Carl to be in pain after sitting on a tack? Well, here's a false start. You couldn't simply identify Carl's jumping up and yelling with Carl's being in pain. That is, Carl's being in pain is not identical to Carl's jumping up. Granted, though, there is a view called Radical Behaviorism that actually would, in fact, identify Carl's jumping up and yelling with Carl's being in pain. So the philosophical behaviorist, or we'll just call it the radical behaviorist, because it's a pretty radical view, is one who identifies mental states, such as pain, fear, and belief, with observable behavior of certain sorts. So, for example, to be in pain is just to yell, ouch, or to jump up. To believe that God exists is just to say out loud, I believe that God exists. It's not this internal mental thingy, it's outward observable stuff. So one interesting consequence of radical behaviorism is that mental states, such as pain, aren't knowable via the first-person perspective. So the old joke is, two behaviorists after a night of passionate lovemaking, one behaviorist looks at the other and says, that was good for you, was it good for me? Because obviously you can't tell. They, watching you and your outward reactions, are the ones who can actually tell. And most philosophers that are sane take this as pretty conclusive evidence that radical behaviorism is a false theory of the mind. And we're just going to assume that throughout this lecture. If you disagree with me, do your best on the discussion board to defend it. So, while Carl's pain is not identical with Carl's behavior, it is at least closely related to Carl's behavior. He jumped up and screamed because he was in pain. So it's reasonable then to suppose that given that sitting on the tack caused Carl's pain, and Carl's pain in turn caused Carl's yelling, that Carl's pain is something that causally mediated the event of sitting on the tack and the event of his jumping and shrieking. So basically, we could say that these blue arrows represent the direction of causation. So then sitting on a tack causes Carl's mental state of pain, and then Carl's mental state of pain causes Carl to jump and shriek.
And Lee had to say, sure.
I apologize. That video is proof positive that the internet is making us, as a species, collectively dumber. Alright, so this much can be said then. We ought to expect events to take place in Carl's nervous system and brain. Events that wouldn't occur if Carl wasn't in pain and hadn't sat on the tack. Further, we'd expect these events on any other occasion that Carl or anyone else is in pain. Well, the identity theorist is going to ask, why not just identify then the pain with those neural events? Well, this leads to what's called the identity theory of mind. It's a materialist theory, and it holds that mental states are identical with states of the brain or nervous system. This doesn't mean that we know, as of right now, which physical states are relevant to various mental states. Instead, the theory contends that there is, though, an identity to be found. And a complete physical description of the workings of the brain and nervous system will tell us all there is to know about mental states. So, the field of neuroscience, while not necessarily committed to the identity theory of mind, probably has quite a few neuroscientists that assume it. So when a neuroscientist gets a subject in an fMRI machine and they see this region of the brain lighting up when a person's making, say, an evaluative judgment about the quality of a movie they've seen, I suspect a lot of neuroscientists will actually do identify. They say, oh, that subject thinking about the movie Transformers, that mental state just happens to be identical to that cluster of neurons we found firing behind their frontal lobe. So this, my suspicion is that this is a theory operative or implicit in some of the neuroscientists that are studying the brain, such as neuroscience. Cognitive science, I think, assumes a different type of theory, and we're going to look at that in another lesson, on the lesson on functionalism. So, but this is kind of like the implicit theories behind both sciences. So, the identity theory has plausible reasons supporting it. First, the brain is really intimately connected with our thinking and feeling. So, for example, there are plenty of cases where when you damage the brain, then it results in a loss of mental or emotional capacities. Anyone that's taken psychology is probably familiar with Phineas Gage, who had his brain pierced with a spear, I think, and then Phineas underwent a radical personality change. And this is so this makes sense of a lot of, well, hardcore evidence that we have. Neuroscientists and neurologists are consistently studying patients with brain damage. Because, well, unfortunately, one of the best ways to understand how the brain works is to study brains that aren't working the way they normally would. And then that tells us when a patient is missing this part of the brain, or this part of the brain is damaged, and then that patient starts manifesting a certain type of behavior then that they normally wouldn't manifest otherwise, that tells you that that part of the brain, if it wasn't damaged, is probably responsible for regulating that behavior. So we have a much deeper understanding of like what parts of the brain support language, mathematical reasoning, different emotional capacities, imagination, motor movement, and so on. So why not go with a theory of the mind that seems to support this science? Well, then go with the identity theory of mind. Oh, I've got an email.
All right. Tell me when I hit the sweet spot.
Deeper, you pusillanimous Pilsner pusher!
All right, all right.
Defense! Defense!
Now, research in artificial intelligence and neurophysiology also supports the thesis that mental states are brain states, or, well, physical states. So here's a question. Does this imply that all pains, fears, beliefs, and desires are physical objects, similar to or in the brain, such as neurons or bits of brainy matter? Well, when discussing dualism, speaking of mental objects is natural, but the identity theorist prefers to talk of mental states that she identifies with brain states. States of things, though, aren't objects. They're ways objects are. And this is an important distinction then. So again, states of things aren't objects. They're ways objects are. Brain states aren't objects. They're ways the brain is. Well, an object is in a certain state then when it has a particular property. But the property, and that's like synonymous with feature or attribute, and that's really just the way the object is. And this is important to grasp because our language oftentimes misleads us. So consider this statement, Vince took a swim. There's Vince. Now, it may appear that in addition to Vince, there are objects called swims. And Vince took it. Or take the example of the statement, the table is red. Is there, in addition to the table, this object called redness? What's kind of a weird thing? What kind of object would that be? A swim or redness? Well, the problem occurs in trying to draw these deep conclusions from language alone. So when we make the statement, Vince took a swim, it's not that there are two things, Vince and a swim, that are somehow related. Instead, we're referring to one object, Vince, and simply saying of Vince that he's swimming or swims. He's in the state of swimming. The same applies with the statement, the table is red. There aren't two objects, the table and redness. Instead, we're describing a way the table is. The table is in the state of being red. Now, let's go back to the mental states then. Take the statement, Carl is in pain. There aren't two objects being related, Carl and pain, where one of the objects is a mental state, according to the identity theorists. Instead, Carl is in a certain state. Being in pain just is a way Carl is. Carl is the object, and being a pain is a state of that object. So again, this is important. For the identity theorist, mental states aren't states of mental objects. Instead, there are no mental objects, although there are mental states like believing, hurting, etc. These states are identical with physical states of the brain. They are ways the brain is. Carl's being in pain isn't this thing that Carl's related to. It's just a way Carl is. Think of your hand in a grasp. You grasp a pen. It's not like the grasp is this second thing in addition to your hand. No, the grasp is what your hand is doing. It's in the state of grasping a pen. It's just a way your hand is at the time. It's in the state of grasping. All right, this is abstract and deep stuff, and it's important that you learn it, though. But let's go to the issue of identity statements then, because remember that this is where the dualist took issue and offered several pretty persuasive and powerful arguments against materialist theories of mind in one of the other lectures. So we'll suppose that the identity theorist is correct. Being in pain, which will prefix with P, just is being in some brain state B. And then the identity theorist says P equals B. This is analogous to identity statements we find in many other sciences. So, for example, chemists say water is H2O. Light is electromagnetic waves. Heat is mean kinetic energy. Lightning is luminous electrical discharges in the atmosphere. Let's talk about lightning for a second. Our calling the phenomenon lightning and describing it as a flash of light in the sky doesn't explain lightning's nature. But identifying lightning with a luminous electrical charge in the sky does. So that identity statement is superior. So if lightning is luminous electrical discharge in the atmosphere, then nothing could be one without the other. This follows from, well, numerical identity and Leibniz's law. Lightning is numerically identical to luminous electrical discharge. Wherever you have lightning, you have luminous electrical discharge. Wherever you have water, you have H2O. Wherever you have heat, you have kinetic, you have motion. Well, there are other examples. So here's a pop culture example for all you kids, you youngins. Snoop Dogg, who is now Snoop Lion, I'm told, is Calvin Cortazar, Brodus Jr. Snoop Dogg is identical to Calvin. No one can be Snoop Dogg and not be Calvin. That's an identity statement. It's an identity statement that you learn something about, though. So we all know who Snoop Dogg or Snoop Lion is, but we learned that that is identical to Calvin. Just like you learn that water is H2O, you learn that lightning is luminous electrical discharge. That you learn that heat is molecular motion. All right. But these are identity statements that we find throughout all the sciences. So it's important then, just because the reference of the word lightning and the reference of the phrase luminous electrical discharge in the atmosphere is the same, does that imply that they mean the same thing? Think about it. Does lightning mean the same thing as luminous electrical discharge? No. Here's another example. Take the example of the morning star and the evening star. Well, we now know that they have the same reference. They are both referred to the planet Venus, but they mean different things. One was the star sailors. The morning star means that star sailors see in the morning. And the other, the evening star, means that star sailors see in the evening. Yet they are identical. The morning star is numerically identical to the evening star. They are numerically the same thing, the planet Venus. They both pick out or refer to the planet Venus. So two words can refer to the same thing without those words meaning the same thing. Well, mental state terms and brain state terms, according to the identity theorists, refer to the same thing, brain states, even though they mean different things. So now we might starting to see a way the identity theorists could maybe respond to the dualist. So consider pain and brain state B. On the identity theory, they refer to the same neurological state even though they do not mean the same thing. And, as mentioned, this gives the identity theorist a response to the dualist. Recall that the dualists used Leibniz's law to argue that mental states are not identical to brain states. If they have different properties, then they are two, not one, according to the dualist. Well, this is how the identity theorists will respond. They'll say, first, it's better to conduct a discussion in terms of mental states, not mental objects. So you've got it wrong from the get-go if you're thinking about mental objects. Second, because mental states are identical with brain states, no differences are to be found between them. Like other physical states, mental states are public. To say that Carl is in pain just is to say that he is in brain state B, which we can in principle find out. through example, through an fMRI machine. It's two different ways to access the same reality, so says the identity theorist. One, you access to the first person. The other way, you access to the third person. But you're accessing the same things. It's just through different means. One through first person, one through third person physical descriptions. This is what the identity theorist will say. And then it's a discovery that they're identical. Just like it's a discovery that the morning star was the evening star, and they were the planet Venus. We made a discovery. All those words all along were referring to the same thing. All right. Well, the identity theory perhaps has this advantage over dualism. If we identify believing, fearing, hurting, etc. with brain states, we don't need to posit this weird, mysterious, immaterial mental substance. So this then allows identity theorists to use the resources of the physical sciences in giving an account of consciousness. The dualist doesn't have this. But all is not well with the identity theory. We have to distinguish between two versions of the identity theory. So I didn't cover this in the lecture on numerical identity when we discussed dualism and materialism. But now we're going to draw a distinction between two different types of identity. One is what philosophers call type identity theory, and the other is what philosophers call token identity theory. We've hinted at this also in the lecture on sentences and propositions, but it's worth going into a little bit more detail. So here's a question. How many words are enclosed in squares on this particular PowerPoint slide? All right, now look at it. Here's a square. Here's a square. Oh, here's a word. Here's a word as well. Looks like in one sense they're the same word. But there are two different words. And one, like one's here and one's here, but on the other hand, they're the same word. Huh. All right. What am I getting at? Well, when I ask how many words are enclosed in boxes, it depends on what I mean by the word same. Or it means by how many. What I really mean is, what are we counting? So there are two different things we could be counting right now. If you mean word tokens, then the answer is 2. There are 2 tokens of the word astronaut. But if you mean word types, then the answer is 1. There is one word type. It's the word astronaut. So philosophers have this distinction between what's called tokens and types. These are, so astronaut on one hand is like a word type. Think of it as like the Beatles may, there was one first Twilight novel, but there was, hundreds of thousands printed. So there are hundreds of thousands Twilight novel tokens, but then there was one Twilight novel type. Well, same with this. There's one word type, astronauts, but then there are 2 tokens of that type. One token here, one token there. Here's another example, iPhones. I used the example of me and my wife's iPhone in a previous lecture. Well, we both have one cell phone type. We both have iPhones. So if you ask how many kinds of phones do we have, the answer would be like 1. But if you ask how many token phones we have, the answer would be 2. My iPhone is a different token from my wife's. Well, let's return then to the identity theory of mind. There's 2 different versions of the identity theory of mind, given this distinction between types and tokens. The first is what we'll call type identity theory. The type identity theory of mind holds that certain kinds or types of mental states, for example, fearing squirrels or being in pain, it's the types that are identical with types of brain states. So, if pain is identical with brain state B, then no one could be in pain without being in brain state B. So types of mental states then are identical to types of brain states. Conversely, no one could be in brain state B, brain state type B, without being in pain, so no one could be in a certain brain state type without also being in a certain mental state type. So they're intimately related. Well, of course they're intimately related. They're numerically identical. So being in brain state B then would be both necessary and sufficient for being in pain, and vice versa. That is, brain state B if and only if mental state P. Question. What if Martians visited Earth?
We come in peace. We come in peace. We come in peace. We come
came in peace.
We come in peace. We come in peace.
This leads to some problems with type identity theory, and not in that Martians are vicious, evil creatures that would destroy humankind with no hesitation and whatsoever. So recall that according to a type identity theorist, someone is in pain if and only if they're in a certain brain state. For example, C fibers are firing. You can't have this brain state without that mental state, and vice versa. But it's conceivable that there are Martians that also feel pain, but they don't have brains. Instead, perhaps they have goo in their skull. And it's conceivable that Martians could have beliefs and fears and desires and so on without having this corresponding neurological states. So why must you have to have this particular brain state to have this particular mental state? It seems like these mental states could be what philosophers call are multiply realized in various hardware configurations. So think of like the analogy between software and hardware. You can install software on a number of different hardware platforms. Well, maybe mental states are like that, but type identity theory just doesn't. You can't get that with type identity theory. But if the type identity theory is true, well, then it wouldn't be the case that Martians experienced pain, had beliefs, etc. Because they don't have the right type of. So this leads to an argument against the type identity theory. Premise 1. If type identity theory is true, then a person P is in mental state type M if and only if they are in brain state type B. And that's just a definition of type identity theory. Premise 2. If a person P is in mental state type M, and if and only if they are in brain state type B, then it's not possible that there are Martians who are in mental state type M and are not in brain state type B. Premise 3. It is possible that there are Martians who are in mental state type M and are not in brain state type B. Conclusion, so type identity theory is false. Now, the premise that philosophers wouldn't challenge, but non-philosophers, undergrads, students who are taking their first philosophy class ever, the premise they might challenge would be premise 3. They would raise their hand and say, Davis, it's not possible that there are Martians. Never mind Martians in mental state type N. It's just there are no Martians. Come on, we all know that. I mean, we got these little rovers on Mars right now with NASA, and there's no evidence of life on Mars. You know what I want to say as a philosopher? Yeah, I didn't say there are Martians. I didn't say that this argument requires that there actually be Martians to work. I'm just saying it has to be merely possible in the logical sense that there's no contradiction in saying that there are Martians in mental state type M and not in brain state type B. So there could be another universe a lot like ours, except that it has Martians on Mars that are really intelligent. So that's all it takes. This is conceivable. All it needs to be is conceivable, logically possible. It doesn't have to be actually the case. So that's not the premise to challenge. At least don't challenge premise 3 insofar as you think that it's not possible there are Martians. All right. Well, the moral of the story then is that you should be careful in crafting identity statements. If one says that water is type identical to H2O, then you're committed to the claim that nothing can be water and not be H2O. So if you find something that's clear, odorless, and tasteless and that fish swim in, but it's not composed of H2O, then it couldn't be water, even though it would be a lot like water. Well, consider a different statement. This desk is identical with this parcel of wood. Well, it could be the case that nothing could be this very chair and not be made of this very parcel of wood. But that's not the claim that nothing could be a chair and not be made of wood. And similarly, recall Carl's being in pain. It may be identified with Carl's being in brain state B, but it doesn't imply that anyone in pain must be in brain state B. or even in a brain state, for example, if you have goo instead of a brain. Well, what are we to do then? Type identity theory just doesn't seem to work. Fortunately, recall that there's a distinction between types and tokens. Well, rather than being a type identity theorist, why not be a token identity theorist? So if you're an identity theorist, you don't have to be a type identity theorist after all. Instead, you could identify tokens of mental states with tokens of brain states and be a token identity theorist. So recall, a token is a particular instance of a type. So rocking chairs are a type of chair. Your grandmother's rocking chair is a token of the type rocking chair. iPhones is a type of cell phone. My particular iPhone in my pocket is a token of the type iPhone. Well, it's the same with brain states. Don't identify pain with types of brain states, and instead identify your pain with this particular brain state. The pain token with the brain state token, okay? Well, the token identity theorist then would identify tokens of mental states, such as Carl's being in pain, with tokens of brain states, such as brain state B1. This avoids the problems that plague type identity theory, as we saw earlier. It allows for Martians to be in pain after all. So, token identity theory then can consistently hold that mental state tokens are identical to brain state tokens, and also hold that Martians could be in pain without requiring that Martians have brains. Marvin's token and true belief that Davis, your instructor is awesome, could be token identified with Marvin's Martian brain goo. That seems to be a big upshot to this version of the identity theory, token identity theory. It's got a definite advantage over the type identity theory. But it's got a disadvantage. Given that token identity theory only makes claims about particular individual mental states, such as Carl's being in pain after sitting on attack, as opposed to pain in general, it has trouble accounting for the nature of types of mental states. So we may know that Carl's being in pain is identical with Carl's brain state B1, but what can we say from there about pain in general? And this leads to a giant cost, a downside, a disadvantage of token identity theory. We want to find lawful, scientific, predictable connections between mental states and brain states if we're going to identify them with each other. If type identity theory were true, then we could do that. But if it's token identity theory, then there's no lawful connection. Yes, it just so happens that every individual particular mental state is identical with a particular brain state, but we want to find something that's in common between Martians and humans, and between individual humans. Because it's conceivable that different humans would have different brain states, even though they have similar mental states. So, if we want to have a science of the mind, it doesn't seem like token identity theory can give that to us. And that's a big cost, a big downside to it. Fortunately, there's a third option. Token identity theory. Identify all mental states with J.R.R. Tolkien.